Hi folks! So I thought I'd do another reading wrap-up video for you today, let you know what I read in September and October and a little bit of November. So let's jump right in. First book I'm going to talk about is Sept-Oct by Garth Nix. And this is a great high fantasy. I think technically it's classified as a young adult novel, but while the main character is a young adult, I think it's kind of more of a, I would classify it more as an all ages, more just fantasy. So the basic premise is the main character has just found out that something has happened to her father, who was a necromancer, and now she kind of has to take up his mantle, and she's trying to find out what happened to him, if he's still alive, if she can rescue him, as well as learning how to use all of her powers. The world, Garth Nix does a great job of world building without making it obvious that he's explaining how the world works to the readers. Like the first little bit, they kept referring to the charter and doesn't really ever spell out that like that is a form of spell casting. It just, you pick it up from the context. And the world is really interesting, and it's just a really great fantastical world and really compelling characters. I love, one of the characters is a cat called Mogget, and is both amazing and terrifying. A really interesting take on how there are these different gates within death. So if you have a player character that wants to play a death cleric, I would suggest reading this to get some ideas of how you can have a necromancer but not be evil. So, and this is actually, when I picked this book up, I did not realize it was the first in a series, but it does stand alone. I think you could easily read this and not have to read the rest because it does tell its own kind of complete story. However, I did go out and pick up Lyria by Garth Nix, which I also read. I did not read this right after Sept-Oct. I had a couple other books that I read in between, but I'm going to talk about this one next. This is the second book in the Aberson trilogy, and I have the third book that I just started reading, which is Aberson, which is the last book. And this book actually takes place a number of years after Sept-Oct, and some of the characters in it are descendants of certain characters in the first book. I'll put it there. And this is a really fun, it deals with Lyria, who's the main character, lives within this society that they are all seers, but she hasn't gotten the ability to see. So she's kind of struggling with that, trying to figure out who she is. The other main character in this book is struggling with accepting who he's supposed to be. And this one is very much, it's clearly the second book in this series, because it does end, it wraps up kind of the main story of this book, but does end a little bit on a cliffhanger, so I'm definitely looking forward to reading Aberson. Continues the great world building, and while it's a fairly good-sized book, it's a fast read just because you're so engaged with the characters. So another highly recommend. So what I read between Sept-Oct and Lyria was Turtles All the Way Down by John Green. I'm sure if you've been looking at anyone's videos on booktubes, you've heard of this book. John Green of Vlogbrothers, also author of Fault in Our Stars. Such a good book. Deals with, the main character has OCD, and just a really good glimpse into what it must be like to live with, John Green also has OCD, so it's writing not his exact experience, but because of that I feel like it gives a truer sense of what it's like to live with that kind of disorder, how it's like to live with a chronic disease and how it affects your life. And it doesn't glorify, you know, OCD like some stories have. Really moving, just highly recommend. I don't want to say much about it, but yes, very good. It's just a really great story of somebody who's trying her best and trying so hard, and I mean, I cried a couple points at this book. I also cry very easily, but it is a very good moving book. A both lighter read because it's shorter and also because it's just a little bit more lighthearted. There wasn't really much crying while I was reading this book, a lot of chuckling and smiling. So the next book I read was All My Friends Are Superheroes by Andrew Kaufman. This was a really fun, it's a very quick read, it's not a very big book, but the premise is that the main character, all of his friends are superheroes. But they're kind of the superheroes that, like, if you sat around and thought of, like, what would the worst superpowers be, some of them are in here. Some of them are legit like, okay, that would be a cool superhero power, but most of them are actually like, if you looked at somebody, like any of your friends, and try and figure it out based on their personality, what their super power would be. Like his girlfriend in this is the perfectionist. One of my favorites, just reading, there are a couple of like just little blurbs on a bunch of different superheroes, is, I think it was called The Spooner, but it was just somebody that instantly knew when somebody needed to be like held, and would wake up in the middle of the night and find their way to that person's place, and the door would be open and they'd just come in and hold them and then leave in the middle of the night. But it's a really fun like little love story, because whole story is his girlfriend has gotten on a plane to fly across the country, and she's been hypnotized so that she can't see him. She doesn't realize he's there, and he knows that he has to convince her by the end of this flight that he's there. He has to make her see him. It's just really sweet, really fun. And also there are a couple of descriptions of monsters in this book that just really help give form to some ideas like anxiety or stuff like that. Just, yes. Good book. Good book. I think this is probably going to make its way to a top list for this year. It was really fun, really good, and something you could easily pick up, and I found myself even rereading a couple of the sections on the superheroes, just kind of be like, I want to reread that. I want to reread that description. That's really clever. And the last book that I read was actually a reread, so I'm not going to talk too much about it because I think I've talked about it before. If I did, I'll put a little card up here to the video, but it was The Darkest Part of the Forest by Holly Black. And I just wanted something to reread. Since I'm working on NaNoWriMo, I wanted something that I knew the story well enough that I wouldn't kind of get lost in it, and this is just such a fantastic book, and it's been a couple years since I read it, so it was like, sure, I'll reread this and jump back in. It's a really great dark fantasy, modern fantasy book. Another highly recommended. The last couple months were actually really good reading. I wasn't disappointed by any of the books that I read. I really liked all of them. I don't think I could pick a favorite out of any of these books, because they were all very good for very different reasons. Let me know what you guys have been reading down in the comments below, and if you have any book recommendations that you think I would enjoy, or book recommendations for anybody else watching, leave them down in the comments. I'm definitely going to be looking for some new books to read, some books to add to my 2018 TBR, and would love to know what you folks all have to say. And of course, if you read any of these books, let me know what you thought. Try and avoid spoilers, or if you have any, if you're going to talk about any major points in the plots, make sure to give like spoiler warnings early on so people aren't spoiled. So don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Roll for Initiative. Bye!